Good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening. I'm Ambassador Kathleen Doherty, and I'll be moderating today's timely conversation on climate change and food security in the Middle East, put on in partnership with the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. On behalf of the World Women's Foreign Policy Group, thank you for joining us today. The Women's Foreign Policy Group is a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership, amplifying their voices through substantive global issues like today's discussion, and preparing the next generation and mid-career professionals for leadership through year-round mentoring and professional development. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers. We have Dr. Sweta Chakraborty, who is a behavioral scientist whose work is motivated by the need for clear, credible science communication to manage human security risks. She merges science's policy and the media to get people the information they need for better behavioral outcomes and a positive impact on the planet. We also are joined by Dr. Wanida Lewis, who is the CEO, founder of Crescendo Foods, a culinary incubator in Accra, Ghana. Previously, she was a senior economic program advisor in the U.S. State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues and a foreign affairs officer and an American Academy of Arts AAAS fellow in the Office of Agricultural Policy. In 2018, Dr. Lewis founded Young, Gifted, and Brown, a pipeline program supporting young Ghanaian women and entrepreneurs in STEM. We have Professor Sajid Maqsood, is a professor and assistant dean for research and graduate studies at the United Arab Emirates University. He's coming us in the evening, so appreciate your time this evening. His research is exclusively focused on food and nutritional needs of the UAE and the region. He's been working on exploring camel milk, dates, and alternate proteins as sustainable food sources in desert climatic conditions. He is a leading active research group in the Food, Nutrition, and Health Department with multidisciplinary collaboration within the UAE University and abroad. We're also joined by Ayat Soliman, who is a regional director for the World Bank's Group's Sustainable Development Department for Middle East and Africa. Dr. Ayat has over 25 years of experience working on global issues of sustainable development at the World Bank, covering water, agriculture, rural, social, and urban development, and climate resilience. To learn more about our speakers, please review their bios on WFPG's website. We want to include your questions as well. You can send them through the Q&A option, which is at the bottom of your screen at any point during the conversation, and we will include as many as we can at the end. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation. Sweta, we're starting with you. We know that the increase in the frequency of extreme weather and higher temperatures is affecting agricultural conditions in the Middle East, with an estimated half of the population in this region living under conditions of water stress. Can you share how you see climate change impacting the livelihoods of millions of people in the Middle East region?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This is a critically important conversation, and we know the planet is warming. Even a 1 to 2 degree increase is going to have massive ripple effects throughout the globe, and particular regions are more vulnerable than others, especially the Middle East and Northern Africa. Climate change is amplifying global food insecurity. It's amplifying water scarcity. It's amplifying climate refugees and the migration crisis. It's amplifying the increasing frequency of infectious disease outbreaks. But we're here focusing on food insecurity. And what that means is that the warming trajectory is making the physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets humans' food preferences and dietary needs for active and healthy life that much more difficult. And so already, even without the warming, we know from the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, that roughly 10% of the world's population is malnourished. And for the Middle East and Northern Africa, this means almost 200 million people are suffering from regular access to sufficient and nutritious food and are hungry. And so with that, even children are being affected. We're seeing stunted growth and malnutrition in 1 in 5 children in the region. And the region also suffers from a higher than global average of being able to afford healthy food. So it's almost at 50%, where the average for the world is 38%. And in addition to all of this, we know that climate change is going to be making this worse. So this is the current state of affairs, but the danger of even more severe food shortages are imminent. because of the impacts associated with increasing temperature, like floods, like droughts, like the scorching of soil and land degradation. These are all things that are resulting in soil not replenishing as quickly as it's disappearing, and it's being unable to be used for farming. And half of the population in this part of the world requires agriculture for economic gain, for livelihoods. So that is impacting people economically in addition to the hunger. And the health impacts of this are obvious. We know that not being able to have access to nutritious food results in metabolic disorder. We know that there's mental health outcomes like increased depression and stress and anxiety. The ripple effects, the point I'm making, are extensive. Ultimately, we know that this is also going to result in people moving location, because if you're not able to farm lands because of increased degradation to soil and land desertification, that's going to harm crop yields and livestock, we're going to see people moving. And so that is what we can anticipate that's coming as the temperature increases. And we'll get into solutions around that, because this can all seem very scary and overwhelming, but it's important to state very clearly that the planet warming is resulting in food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa and throughout the entire world.
Well, thanks for teeing up a very complicated issue and touching on all the aspects of it. And I just remember the images of last year with the locusts that hit, or I guess that was 2020, and how that was so unprecedented, the locust plague that happened. But turning to Wanida, and I know Sweta mentioned a brief impact on women and girls, and I know you've done a lot of work about climate change and food insecurity that have a unique impact on women and girls. Can you do a little bit more of a deep dive on that, and what policies are needed to be in place to specifically address the impact of on women and girls?
Sure. For one thing, a lot of people generally acknowledge that women and girls face a heavier burden of domestic work as a result of resource shortages. And what happens with climate change is that it affects the resources such as food, water, and firewood. And then what ends up happening is that because women and girls are the ones responsible to going to get these resources, they ended up, of course, they have to walk a longer distance. That, of course, increases the incidence of gender-based violence. And so and also any type of sexual harassment. And so the list goes on. And if you look at it from an entrepreneurship standpoint with women, of course, is that they're trying to do this work, and they're the ones who are working in the fields, and they're doing, all the crops and the harvesting. They don't have the access to the machinery that's needed to be able to combat that. It usually goes to men first. And so there's so many things around that. And when we talk about the policies, one is that, when we think about agriculture, a lot of the times we think of it in silos. We don't see how these things actually go across, they overlap. And so when women and girls are, their security is affected, that means that everyone else's security is affected. So when we're talking about what policies need to be placed, is that, one, peace and security needs, of course, be as a language talking about when women and girls are attacked, that means that it affects the entire community. That's a policy that, or language that should be put into place. And then when we're looking at it from an entrepreneurship standpoint, how can women have access to, if they're trying to start a business, having access to capital, but also having access to this information. And so there is a huge disconnect between that. And of course, is that when we're talking about food shortages, is that men, in most cultures, men are the ones who are asked to, of course, eat first. And so if they're eating first, there's definitely not enough food for the women and girls to eat. So I'll stop there, but there's so much more in that space that I could talk about all day.
We will. I'll give you more of a chance. Why don't I just get through the first round of questions and go back to some of the themes that have already been raised. Sajid, your research focuses on how some traditional products like camel milk and dates can be sustainable food sources amidst climate change. How can traditional crops be cultivated differently? And how do these two foods address some of the food security challenges unique to the United Arab Emirates?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Pleasure to meet all of you. Well, talking about my research on camel milk and dates, I have been doing this research from last almost 6-7 years. So I believe there's a huge potential for camel milk and dates to serve as resilient as well as sustainable food sources especially in the harsh climatic conditions which are existing in UAE and the region and other Arab countries. So the camel milk and dates have been the part of the traditional food, traditional diet in UAE and the region since many believe or us in
I think they're just losing you a little bit, yeah, on your internet connection.
Yeah.
And can you maybe just repeat the last maybe 30 seconds?
Yeah, I mean to say the challenges of climate change.
I think we're still having a little bit problems with why don't we go back to you in about a minute, and hopefully your connection works a little bit better at that point. Ayat, I know we've already touched about some of the challenges of food insecurity in Middle East and North Africa, but I know you've done so much work that I'd like to get your views on where the trend lines are and what the causes are.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here and to also come after Sweta and Wanida, who have really touched on a number of dimensions of the problem. So if you look at the Middle East and North Africa, there have been already some underlying trends, right? There was an increase in food insecurity driven by a unique combination of factors depending on which country. Climate change obviously has been manifesting itself over the last decades, and it's going to continue to increase, and I'll talk about that. But then also you have fragility and conflict driving supply chains and food prices in different countries, economic shocks. You mentioned the locust outbreak that has, devastated the products of Yemen and Djibouti in the Middle East, but also the Horn of Africa in the past 2 to 3 years. So all of these combinations happen. And then, of course, external factors that affect MENA, because MENA is also a very highly food import dependent region. So especially on wheat and staple grains, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries rely on 90% of their food as imports. And it also has another trend that keeps then pushing that pressure upward, which is the increasing population growth, one of the highest population growth rates worldwide. And many more people are moving to urban areas. And it goes to what Wanida said about who are the farmers of tomorrow in the Middle East and North Africa. Agriculture is a big mainstay for the region. Water stress, of course, is very high. And who are the young people embracing the agriculture sector as in the past or not? And we can come to that in terms of how we can crowd in young men, but also young women into the sector and support them in doing that. Again, if I can then focus and zoom in on one of the key trends that we see are going to be a threat is climate change. And Sweta mentioned a bit of that already. Look, I mean, the region is extremely water stressed already, and the latest IPCC projections are showing that the region is expected to possibly see a 5% temperature rise in the next less than a century. Half of the population is already living under extreme water stress in the MENA region, and the UAE in particular, for example, is one of the highest in terms of the water stress. And with population growth up to 700 million by 2050, per capita water availability will be half, further compromising agricultural production. So all of these factors combined, it's almost like a perfect storm. That's why it's so good that we're zooming in on this. The bank has done a lot of support and research looking at what can be done, both in terms of the production, but also on the demand side. And that goes perhaps to the point on nutritional value and diets, right? Those have historically also been, despite widespread hunger, there is also obesity in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's a paradox. Where is that coming from? Obviously, possible that it is because some of the wheat products are mostly subsidized, and that consumption then increases. But also, it's awareness, it is caloric deficiency in the other high value, high protein and high vitamin intensive food products. And so our food systems in the Middle East, we say, are failing the people's health. The food provides calories, but it's not sufficient nutrition. So I gave an overview, but of course we can go deeper in different elements of those challenges in the.
Well, I think you teed it up really well to go back to Sajid to capture some of those traditional food sources that you're working on and how that could be part of the solution.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Great, yeah. So I was talking about that camel milk and dates have been there, a part of the tradition from many, many years. And these are resilient and sustainable food sources in this Middle East and the climatic conditions which are prevailing here and which are expected to get worsen in coming future. So the need is to diversify the camel milk and the dates, because currently there is a huge production of dates in the country and as well as other neighboring countries. But the diversification of these date production is not still yet there. So we need to see how best we can diversify and produce some novel food products using date as a raw material. So that will really serve a huge, that will play a very important role in addressing the food security issues. For camel milk, currently the camel milk is also completely underutilized. It's mostly being consumed as fresh milk or fermented milk. So again, here the need is to diversify and produce some novel products from the camel milk. And as well as we know the camel milk is really known for its health benefits as compared to the bovine milk. So this can be, we can take advantage of this by producing some novel and functional foods with additional health benefits, where we can fortify camel milk-based powders or proteins. So the research in this direction is very important and it is needed. Apart from that, I believe there is a need for camel breeding so that we can make sure we can increase the population and we can have enough camels for producing the milk, and that will serve the purpose of addressing this issue. Means in conclusion, I can say means camel milk and dates are having the potential to serve as a sustainable source of food, even in harshest climatic conditions which are prevailing in this region especially. And I believe these are the very important food sources for us.
Thank you very much. Sweta, we talked about all the causes of food insecurity. We know conflict drives food insecurity, that hunger can also act as a major trigger for instability and conflict. And food insecurity can aggravate poverty, tribal, ethnic dissensions, and dissatisfaction with governments. Putting on your behavioral scientist hat, can you do a deeper dive into the link between conflict and food insecurity?
Absolutely. I'll put on that hat and I'll also put on my climate and security hat. So I've been involved in these communities for quite some time, and the link may not necessarily be obvious, but it's very clear for those of us that are working in this space. We know that a warming planet is threatening critical infrastructure around the world. For the United States, where I'm based, for the Middle East and North Africa, and with allies of these regions throughout the world. And that can drive instability. It can embolden competitors and adversaries, and it can challenge multilateral governance structures, like efforts that the UN is making to actually see through some of these policies and disseminate them in a way that is really helpful to those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. If we don't think of climate change as a security threat and a security issue, ultimately these efforts will prove futile. So that's really the link there. We know that climate-induced food insecurity really multiplies existing security risks. So if there's already tensions around racial, religious, socioeconomic lines, these become heightened with climate change. And what we see is there's research showing the case for this, the most notable being that of Syria, the Syrian war. The robust research shows that it's water scarcity that really kicked off the tensions there and made this historic lands that were historically arable no longer able to be farmed. And in addition to Syria, there are areas in Central Africa, like the Sahel region, where traditionally arable lands, again, are no longer able to be farmed. And what does that mean? Now we see young men that are seeking to be able to feed their families, to be able to seek better economic outcomes for their families, to look for opportunities elsewhere. And with other tensions that exist in this part of the world, like the power vacuum that is Libya, this has created this almost perfect terrorist recruitment and breeding ground. So you see these young men who are looking for better opportunities, and they're getting pulled in to these recruitment efforts. And that is a very, very scary but clear link between how food insecurity, how climate change leading to food insecurity is resulting in direct access for terrorist groups that have very nefarious intentions for the US and allies around the world. And so us even taking terrorist recruitment aside, we see that there's just a need to leave lands that are no longer going to be meaningful for the future of communities that historically were able to be. People aren't just going to stay and die in locations that are inhospitable to human life. We know that at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, that sweat doesn't melt off the human body, and it's increasingly dangerous to work outside, to farm. So imagine in this region, in the Middle East and Northern Africa, where the degree temperature in Fahrenheit can get to 140 degrees and above. I mean, nobody's gonna stay there and live like that and die in that situation. So there will be movements of people. And in 2020, we saw that 30 million people were displaced just in 2020 from climate-related disasters. And the majority of those people, 90% of these people, come from countries that are among the most vulnerable and that are least able to adapt to these new warming trends and the implications through access to food, water, and everything else that I mentioned in the beginning. And it's not just the displacement, it's also the receiving of refugees that are moving because of climate conditions, coming into a new country, and the potential for that to result in state fragility and state collapse and even further displacements of peoples. This is the type of situation that we really need to get ahead of and we really need to avoid, because that is where hyper-nationalist political forces can really find where their message can resonate, and they can dig in and take hold of that vulnerability. And so if we really are talking about addressing climate change, we need to think about this from a national and international security angle and recognize that it's the displacement of peoples that we need to be anticipating, and the reception of these peoples in a way that really allows services to better integrate the new reality of migration that we're going to be experiencing. That means better healthcare for refugees coming in, more resources, more services, and being able to overcome any language barriers. These are all kinds of things that it's really critical to be thinking about as we have this conversation.
Well, thank you. And I think, again, you really phrased well the very daunting challenges. And I think we can get a little bit discouraged by the challenges. And I think we're going to shift focus a little bit to maybe some of the solutions that are being pursued and encouraged. And Wanida, I'm going to start with you. And I'm really been intrigued by your business, food business incubator network, and your network's of kind of food entrepreneurs in Ghana. And I'd be interested in hearing how you see that work having to address some of the challenges of food security and some of the issues of the impact on women.
Sure. So I guess I'll first start with when I lived here before in 2018. I worked in the regional environmental office at the U.S. Embassy based in Accra, Ghana. And what I noticed is that, of course, in Ghana, it's been well known that they have, I think, one of the largest numbers of women entrepreneurs, in the continent. And so it was great to meet all these women entrepreneurs. It was great to understand how they were able to have successful businesses, but I kept hearing the same thing, which was access to capital. And then as you look in the world, just globally, with all women entrepreneurs, that's usually the problem, is access to capital, access to finance, the list goes on and on. And so if they do not have access to this money, then of course it helps to drive countries becoming more food insecure, right? So you're not able to produce the way you can, because you're putting not only a limit on your own production, but also you end up shutting yourself out of global market linkages. And so all these things come into place. And so when it's not just Ghana, but it's in all places. And I think the thing is that when I was at the State Department, we worked with the WFPG, was the Women's Entrepreneurship Finance Initiative, and it was getting women, we're talking about access to capital. And of course, one of the biggest issues were banks. And the African Development Bank, they had a huge initiative at the time, which was working with banks across the 54 countries in Africa, because, you have gender bias. And so there's so many different things that when we think about, food security, and we talk about climate change, we automatically assume it's only a few things. But if you go further and further into the layers, it's very deep. And so what, with my job is that, yes, we're supporting early stage entrepreneurs by providing a shared commercial kitchen space so that they're able to produce, because most of the time is that if you hear, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, a lot of people can only produce in their kitchen. And so they're not going to spend the $100,000 needed, let alone if they have it, to be able to buy that commercial kitchen equipment, so that if they're making 300 pounds of food, if they have the commercial kitchen, maybe it'll take them up to 350 or even 375, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is what the goal of Crescendo Foods is in Ghana, but it's something that can be applied all over. You see these kitchen incubators in the US, you see them in parts of Europe, you see them in Israel, but you do not see it on the continent of Africa at all. And, and the thing is now is that what are we going to do? Because we also, when we talk about women and girls, we also have to talk about the youth in general, young boys. What are they going to do? So if you look at what has happened historically in cultures outside of, the West, and I wouldn't even say outside the West because it happens in the United States as well, is that you have instances where you have young boys who are sent to work early, and then they are also part of the early child marriage, right? They're 10 years old, 12 years old, having to marry someone, and they're also stunted too. So not only we're just looking at women and girls, but youth as well, when it comes to young men, because everyone's affected. And if they're not able to produce the food that they need to feed their community, then the entire society is going to be affected as a whole.
Great, thank you. So again, looking forward to some solutions. Sajid, you've done some great work on the traditional crops. I'm kind of curious about how you see some other developments in the UAE that are addressing food security challenges that are unique to the country. And if there's any link to what the UAE wants to do going into the Conference of Parties, which we'll host in 2023.
Yeah, I believe the UAE is taking the food security challenge very seriously, and they are putting dedicated efforts to address this food security challenge in the country, especially in coming future. They have a strategic plan by 2030. So they are planning to increase their food production by at least 3 times. So recently, the Food Tech Valley initiative has been launched, by His Highness Prime Minister of the country, and that initiative is really aimed at increasing the food production, local food production, by 3 times through smart food agricultural farming, through R&D facilities and innovative agriculture technologies, and also application of AI and Internet of Things. So all these new technologies, from smart to AI to IoT, all of these have been considered for increasing the food production in the country. Apart from that, the country is very much serious about investing in vertical farming, as well as other novel technologies like hydroponics, aquaponics, aeroponics, because here the issue is that the soil is not fertile enough and the temperatures are really going high. So the urban farming and the indoor farming is really an important aspect here, which can address the food security challenge in the country. And moreover, there is a strategic investment in aquaculture sector. Aquaculture is having a very great potential in this country. So there are plans to expand the aquaculture sector by specifically introducing some new species, which will be suitable for this climatic condition, and they will be having faster growth. So the aquaculture production is also one of the very important strategy. The country is looking forward to that. Recently, we were running a project with the FAO on understanding the needs of the customers, what kind of species of the fish they are preferring more, and whether those species will be suitable for aquaculture, indoor, as well as maybe cage culture. So all these explorations are happening currently to understand what kind of new species of fish can be introduced to expand the aquaculture industry in the country. So moreover, I believe the recently winning the bid to host COP28 is another indication that how serious the country is taking the challenge of climate change, as well as its effect on the food security. So all these efforts and investments to address the food security I think these are the really important steps and examples I have shared with you how UAE is trying to tackle the food security issues in the country, especially, and they are aiming to be the like a number one food secure country by next 20-30 years.
Thank you. So Ayat, we all turn to the World Bank for solutions to these big major global challenges. And I'd like to ask you to share some of the great work that you're doing and the organization is doing.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I will again build on the great points that my colleagues have already made. I think the role of the bank is not to actually find the solutions. I mean, we don't derive the solutions ourselves, but we aggregate the experiences and the solutions that are existing and that have been tested and being tested across private sector, research institutions and with governments across countries and regions, and trying to aggregate from that what would be the interventions at the policy level, at the practice level, and also in the innovation sphere that can be brought together to solve some of these tough issues. So, you know, we want to reach programs that can increase the value added of the agriculture, increase the productivity, and increase the resilience to climate. And I think the experiences are now aggregating a lot more. And I want to, what Sajid mentioned in his last points, what the UAE has been doing in the last decade or so is really at the frontier in terms of desert agriculture, urban agriculture, and climate resilient. I had the pleasure of, just before the pandemic, actually, my last visit was to the UAE, and I visited the Biosaline Agriculture Institute, and their fields of testing of different crops is really interesting to see. And they're not just working on it in the UAE, but with a lot of farmers across regions that are in different climate conditions. So those are all helpful to bring into bear. Now, what the bank is doing is really looking at it, as I mentioned, at these three levels, you know, the policy level, what kind of policies and mechanisms are needed for the private sector, for the farmers, for the producers to actually work on these. And I think finance, of course, is a critical one. And that's something we work with the government, not just for us to channel financing to the government, but that these financing options are accessible to the farmers when and if they need them, including small farmers and remote placed farmers. And then, of course, we work on the aggregation of packages of solutions at the technical level that we provide support on in our projects. And we have several of those in the Middle East and North Africa. I invite you to look at our website. In Morocco, we have had over decades engagement on climate smart agriculture, with the last of those generations being to support the green generation strategy of the government of Morocco. And that includes, you know, working on water saving techniques, heat tolerant plants, but also very important access for young people to credit and to digital technology and solutions and innovations that allow them to really engage along the value chain and be part of the production system in the countries. I think an important other element of the kind of things that we do in the agriculture sector space at this point, and that is very much linked to the international dialogue and debate, is nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions very much work in terms of conserving, restoring, and better managing the ecosystem. It is not by thinking about the production of today, but by thinking in how far can we conserve the land to maintain its productive capacity over time. And that, as you know, includes different techniques of tillage and conservation and rotational grazing, etc. And of course, also looking at coastal wetlands and restorative agricultural practices, fertilizer use, etc. So, and that is becoming increasingly important, not just because of the resilience aspect, but also because it has a very important element as a carbon sink in the broader climate discussion and in the agriculture space. We have a strong engagement on the policy dialogue with the United Arab Emirates and with many countries in the region on the climate agenda. In fact, I saw a question about why the climate discussion is more skewed to the West. Absolutely not. Policymakers in the Middle East are very aware of the risks and they're very aware of the challenges. And there's a heightened mobilization of resources and support for the agenda. It is challenging. As you know, Egypt is hosting the next COP27 this coming November. And then after that, the UAE. So the road goes fully through MENA, and the dialogue is going to be focused heavily on how do we increase the resilience of water, agriculture, and different systems in the face of this threat. I have put a link to our climate action plan, which is a roadmap for climate action for the Middle East and North Africa. I invite everybody to take a look at it and to reach out if you need more information. We've tried to really gather those priorities and the programs that we have ahead to confront them.
Thank you, Ayat, and thank you for referencing some of the questions and answers that are coming, in from the audience. And actually, I'll turn to those questions now. And first, thank you for such thorough answers to my questions. But picking up on the communication issue, I know you, Ayat and Sajid, you talked about how governments are aware, but I'm curious, Sweta, maybe you can talk about the general population and the awareness of some of these issues between climate change, food security, conflict. How do you communicate to what the challenges are ahead, not only to the people experience it on the ground, they know it, but how do you create some better communication and better awareness of these issues?
Yeah, well, this is my challenge day to day. And the challenge is getting communication to be part of the solutions that are devised. And we have so many tools. That's the beauty of this great challenge that we're all facing globally, is that we have human ingenuity has gotten us to the point where we have the behavioral interventions, we have the science, we have the technology. We need to be able to deploy it much better, and we need to put more research and development funding into the innovation pipeline for greater challenges to come. We can anticipate what those will be, and we can get behind it and support that. But the communications part of this tends to be what's missing. And that's where we see the political will falter in seeing these solutions actually implemented and seeing the funding needed for this innovation actually being provided. So communication is really key here. And what we've learned is that you can't just top down drop facts and data and science. That's not how the general public and those who represent them, the policymakers, that's not how they respond and make decisions. But we know this as well. There's actually a science to communication. So there's a science in how to communicate science. And we need to do this much better as a science community. And we are doing it. And we are seeing now, as part of the solution packages that are being developed and being put out there, that communication really is key. We need to have support from the public. We need to have that reinforce any policy decisions going forward. These two things are really mutually reinforcing. So it's really key to identify the different demographics that solutions are being co-created with. And it's important to make sure that the messaging that is going to these communities are resonating with the actual recipients. We need to understand, first and foremost, what are the existing risk perceptions in different groups? And then based on that, how do you develop messaging so you can address those existing perceptions and hopefully inspire behavioral outcomes that are aligned to the science and to the data. So that is what we're seeing more of now, is the time to actually understand that end recipient. Who are the different publics? Somebody in the Midwest of the United States is different from somebody in Bangladesh and India. And we can't just say, here's a risk and you need to change your behavior. You need to retreat inland, or you need to change where your energy source is coming from. Rather understand what those existing schemas are that people hold dear and adjust the messaging accordingly. And then we'll see much more support for policies, support for solutions, and widespread behavioral change.
Thank you. So Gina, there are two questions that I think maybe you might be best posed to answer. One is the question about, are there traditional farming practices that can be reclaimed to limit the loss of arability? And another question is about, can you talk a little bit more about urban farming? We can't hear your audio for some reason. No. Nope, it's still off. Let me try again. Okay, well, I'll give you time to think about those answers and hopefully we can get you back and do it. Wanida, I'm also, you touched upon the issue of financing and having capital be sent into this issue. it's a issue that I'm particularly intrigued about financing, and especially for women and women entrepreneurs. I'm curious again if you can maybe go a little bit more deeper into that issue of the challenges of convincing, whether it's venture capital, angel investors, or just even in terms of entrepreneurs. How do you get more capital to address some of these issues?
I'll definitely say due to the pandemic, it's becoming a little bit harder, and I can just speak to that as an entrepreneur myself. Before you find, pots of money to an extent for early stage, and now, people really want to see the work that you've done. They really do their due diligence all because of that pot of money. But when it comes to, even finding that access to capital, it becomes even more critical for women and, women entrepreneurs. And if you get into it, you not only we're talking about gender, but also talking about race. And so it becomes a bit of an issue because, if you're talking to a bank or even sometimes just the VCs, they may believe that, oh, women do not know how to pay back their debt. They'll be the ones to use their money for this and this. But there's been studies time and time again, there's statistics showing that actually if you give your money to a woman entrepreneur, she'll actually pay it back on time and actually will give you back your interest as well. And, and it's been proven over and again. And, we even saw that within the United States as well, is that, women, if you're looking at like women of color, for instance, you're leaving because they don't have that access, you're leaving trillions of dollars on the table because they don't have it. And so one way, I think of, educating people, and really addressing those biases, especially if we're talking about the Middle East and North Africa, is that women are the ones who receive the money to go to the market to get things, or they're the ones that their husbands make the money, possibly they give it to their wives, right? And so, the thing is putting two and two together, making the connection. If you trust your wife with the money to go do X, Y, and Z, then why don't you trust your wife to, do the same, trust the same woman to be able to, produce more? Because if you want to be selfish about it, you can say like, hey, if she has more money, that also may mean that you will have more money, making that connection. And so it's a very challenging time. A lot of people always say, oh, just go to this person, go to this venture capitalist. But if you're an early stage entrepreneur and they're saying you have to make $100,000 in revenue, you should be in business for 2 or 3 years. You need to be registered. Also, registration can be a problem depending on the country, because that may be a problem for women. You may not be able to register, or you can only register your business if a man is present. So you have all these other obstacles that, of course, all relate to money. So I think if there's not only education, not only from a venture capitalist, but also from a government approach, because also governments, they support that, right? So you can't tout that we support women or women entrepreneurs, but you don't have any policies in place to do otherwise. So it becomes more of an oxymoron.
Great. Sajid, you want to try it again? Hopefully we can get you back on audio.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Great. So I was talking about the novel technologies which can be implemented, which are more suitable for this region, keeping in view the climatic conditions here. So a lot of efforts are being currently diverted towards vertical farming, hydroponics, aquaponics, and which will require less water resources and which will be also able to tolerate the high temperature which is prevailing here. So currently there is a lot of integrated agriculture happening, where the vegetables or some crops are being grown along with other livestock like poultry or fish. So such kind of modern technologies, apart from the smart agriculture, are being currently given more consideration, which are really important for the future agricultural production and increasing the food production in the country. So the second question was about, I think, urban agriculture, right? Yeah.
Okay.
So the urban agriculture is still not, it's not still established here. Some ideas are being floated that this is also a viable option or viable solution for securing the food in this country, because you have a lot of buildings here, a lot of urbanization has already happened here in the country, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. So recently, Dubai Electricity and Water Authority has tried to do some rooftop farming of some green leafy vegetables. So they were able to produce some quantity, a good quantity of green leafy vegetables using the thick mat, green mat technology for for irrigation, which will reduce the water utilization by those particular green leafy vegetables. And apart from that, this urban agriculture will also have an additional benefit that it will decrease the indoor temperature of those buildings by around 5 to 10 degrees, because when you will have a garden on top of the building, so it will be really effective also to decrease the temperature inside the building. So this urban agriculture, rooftop agriculture or rooftop farming, apart from vertical farming and aeroponics, all these can be introduced in the urban areas rather than going to the agricultural farm where there are a lot of challenges of water scarcity, high salinity in the soil, and high temperatures.
Thank you. We've got a few questions that are very similar in theme in terms of the potential of the Middle East and parts of Africa being almost inhospitable because of climate change and the great forces that might unleash refugees and migration issues. I wonder if I can give the floor back to Ayat and Sweta just to go a little bit deeper in these issues, because obviously it's a big concern for people. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about these issues. We're starting with Ayat.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll address that, and maybe if you allow me, I'll also address a couple of questions that came that are specifically directed at the bank's role in IDA countries, International Development Association, which are the lower income countries, and actually the confluence of those that are most vulnerable to climate change and to climate-induced migration, and where we work what are considered IDA countries is really there. So I think it answers partly that question as well. So if you look in the Middle East and North Africa, two countries are IDA countries, Yemen and Djibouti. Yemen is in active conflict. And of course, food insecurity has been rampant in
Did we lose Ayat? All right, Sweta, we can turn it back over to you, and you can pick it up, and then we'll turn to Ayat when she gets back.
Sure, no problem. That's one of my biggest fears with any sort of Zoom situation is being frozen in a very awkward contortion. Okay, so I would say that the positives here, right, is that even with this unprecedented risk that we're talking about, and I know how scary this sounds, we're talking about sea level rise and rainfall variability, wildfires, biodiversity loss, new diseases. This can be really overwhelming, but with this unprecedented risk, what we like to say in the climate and security circles is that we have unprecedented foresight. And that's what I get very excited about. And the group that I work with, We Don't Have Time, it's about confronting the climate crisis with solutions. We have the solutions. We have to figure out the best way to work together, to communicate, to really see these solutions come into fruition. And so for these impacts that I just mentioned regarding and the trends that were raised in the Q&A about human migration, et cetera, we have advanced climate modeling. We have accurate predictive tools that can actually track state instability. And we have artificial intelligence, and these are improving constantly, our forecasting tools. And it's harder to catch some stuff, like terrorist activity is harder to track, nuclear proliferation, it's getting better. But climate, the impacts of climate change, we can track. We have that unprecedented foresight. We know human behavior as well. So we know how humans are going to move and behave. Humans don't go that far from where they were born. Even with all of the opportunity to travel, we still end up staying close to where we originated. That's one of the quirks of our innate natures. And so we know that forced migration, those that are forced to leave where they're from will still probably stay, if able to, within a certain radius. And we can prepare for that. And that's where we need to really think this through, all the way from multilateral efforts and governance. The UN Security Council is really aggressively looking into this. There is this new group, the UN Group of Friends on Climate and Security, that the US has joined and is a member of. And additional alliances have also been created to really address a lot of these issues we've been discussing. For example, the International Military Council on Climate and Security is a new alliance established just recently, a few years ago, in addition to NATO, that is really looking at the impact of climate and security and how we can work together with with allies around the world to ensure that these tools, like the AI, like these predictive modeling tools that are already in the pipeline, that are being developed in the pipeline and that already exist, are really being used to our advantage. So we can get ahead of the migration issue. So we can really be prepared in receiving climate refugees once that challenging migration is made. And so that is some of the takeaways that I wanted to make sure I was able to share with this group.
Ayat, I think you're back.
I am back. Apologies. My internet actually failed, so I'm on the phone, but I hope you can hear me and see me well. And I was able to catch the last of my colleagues' points. So I covered what we're doing in Yemen. I wanted to highlight that also Djibouti is another IDA country where we're doing a lot to support food insecurity based on climate change, but also on the influx of migrants from the Horn of Africa that Djibouti has seen as a small, essentially city-state. And if you look beyond the Middle East, I think the African continent is where the confluence of these issues is extremely important. And so really looking at the dimensions of security and how do you use food security to stabilize production systems, reduce the outflow of people that are food insecure, and hence also the potential for violent conflict that we have seen that erupts often around fight over resources, scarce resources, water resources. So all of these things are part of the support systems that we look into when we support different countries. I think perhaps one question I wanted to also briefly address is what could students do in that whole space? And I really want to talk just for a minute about that. It is extremely important that we see more interest and voice of young people that are motivated in this space to demand the action that is required, because some of these policy actions are difficult. They are difficult for policymakers to make, to direct resources towards the more vulnerable parts of their countries, their population, to provide access to finance, etc. So the voice of young people, the awareness around what is at stake in terms of the issues, what is at stake in terms of the impacts of climate change tomorrow, that debate is alive today. It's critical, and I think young voices are the most important for the fight ahead. So just to really underscore how important.
Because we only have about 4 minutes left, but I wanted to ask each one of you what you would say to some of our young audience members about how to get involved. So thank you for being the first to answer. Wanida, what would you say to the younger generation that's inheriting the problems that a lot of us have helped create?
Yeah, I would definitely say, I think one of the biggest things is that to the youth, to the younger generation, it's hard to communicate with people who are older than you, and that could be very frustrating. And so, the thing is, they said the same thing to their generation as well. And I think the thing is that keep doing what you're doing, but also look at the lessons learned from the generations past. Because sometimes it's not about they were too chicken done to do it. It just may have been a lot more boundaries that have been placed in front of them that they weren't able to do what you would like to do. So I think that's one of the challenges I always see when it comes to younger generations. And also to take advantage of all things. I think, we all come from a generation where we're supposed to be following this certain blueprint to do X, Y, and Z to solve this problem. But there's more ways to skin a cat, for lack of a better words. And so I would say team up with people who aren't from your socioeconomic class, who don't look like you, who aren't in the same gender space as you, whatever that looks like, and then actually come up with the solution and then try to implement. And then, of course, there's always opportunities to just bring some noise, be the change that you want to see, because you're going to be the generation that's going to be here, so on and so forth. And I'd like to end with, if you don't want to hang with the big dogs, stay on the porch, right? So you have to be able to know that you're going to have to get off the porch if you want to see change.
Great. Sajid, what would you say to a young person who's listening to us?
I think my colleagues have provided very good advices to our younger generation, but I would like to maybe add on what has been already said. I think younger generation has a very important role to address the food wastage issue, because food wastage is a really serious issue. I think they can play a very important role in making themselves a responsible citizens of the world and in addressing the food wastage issues, as well as they can play a role in educating others as they grow, as they move ahead in life. I think they have a very important responsibility to play, especially with respect to food wastage. And also, I will advise the younger generations that we want more younger generations to play a role in research. Being a researcher myself, I believe there should be more involvement and more contribution of the younger generation in research on climate change, food security, agricultural production, food production, food processing, and all those aspects which are going to make our world food secure, and we will be able to face the challenge of food insecurity, and we will be in a position to feed our growing population. Thank you.
Sweta, we've got 30 seconds for great inspirational words for the next generation.
Yeah, sure. I'll make it very simple. So to follow up on everything my colleagues just said, here's a way to do it. Here's a really tangible action step to take. Join the We Don't Have Time platform, if I'm pointing correctly. It's free, download and make a profile and immediately connect with your peers around the world, young people, older generations as well. Regardless of where you are on the planet, you can find like-minded, because it's all global concerned citizens that are users of this platform. You can find individuals, you can find campaigns that you can actively get involved in, because one person can make an impact. Sure, we've seen it happen with Greta Thunberg and other young people, but imagine adding a second person. Now you're a team. Imagine a third. Now you're a group, and the impact is whatever you want it to be. We help amplify solutions to the climate crisis, and we need everybody to join and be part of the solution.
Well, thank you. Well, I think we started off the conversation with being very challenged by all the challenges ahead and the daunting impact of climate change and food insecurity, but we ended up on a really hopeful note and really active, engaged note. So I want to thank all the panelists for your superb contributions. I know we could have gone on for hours, and I hope we have an opportunity to continue this conversation, but I want to thank you on behalf of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates for a fantastic conversation. For those who are not members of the Women Foreign Policies Group, please look at our website. We try to do as many great, we do a lot of great programming, and we'd love to be happy to be part of it. And again, just a really big thank you to Sweta, Ayat, Wanida, and Sajid for all your great contributions. And it was an honor to be on the same panel with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.